Good evening, and welcome back to Midnight Whispers, the place where the line between genius and madness fades into the night. Tonight, I'll tell you a story that begins with fame, redemption, and a man who fooled an entire nation into believing he had changed. His name was Jack Unterweger, a celebrated Austrian writer, a poet of pain, and a killer who wrote his own obituary with the blood of his victims. Born in August of 1950 in the quiet town of Judenburg, Austria, Jack's childhood was anything but quiet. His mother was a barmaid, his father an American soldier who never knew his son existed, and Jack grew up in the shadows of neglect and rage. By his teenage years, he was already swimming through a life of crime, theft, assault, pimping, all before he turned 20. And then came the night that sealed his fate, 1974, when he strangled an 18-year-old girl named Margaret Scheffer with her own bra. For that, he was sentenced to life in prison, a cage where monsters usually die forgotten. But Jack, he learned to write behind the bars of his cold cell. He began to craft poems, novels, and radio plays that painted him as a man reborn. He became a symbol of rehabilitation, a living masterpiece of second chances, adored by Austrian artists and intellectuals. In 1990, they believed him. They opened his prison door and sent him back into the world, calling him proof that art redeems. But redemption was never part of his story. The writer they freed was the same man they locked away. Only now, he had a new pen, and his ink was blood. At first, Jack basked in fame. He appeared on television, gave interviews, lectured about morality, and spoke of how prison had made him a better man. But in the dark corners of Vienna, women were vanishing. Between 1990 and 1991, 7 prostitutes were found strangled in Austria, their naked bodies dumped in forests, posed in obscene positions. Each was bound with her own undergarments, bras, stockings, pantyhose, tied in a precise knot, like a signature on a confession. It was the same knot Jack had used on Margaret Scheffer 15 years before. Police whispered theories, reporters speculated, but no one wanted to believe that the nation's most famous reformed man was killing again. Jack smiled through it all, sitting on talk shows, sipping coffee, and writing about the psychology of violence, as if describing someone else's sins. But inside, the killer had never left. By the summer of 1991, his hunger had grown bolder, darker, more daring. He accepted an assignment from Austrian media, a journalistic journey to the United States, to report on the underbelly of Los Angeles, the city of angels and devils. He told his editors he wanted to compare prostitution in Europe and America. They believed him. He packed his bags, his notebook, and his rope when he landed in L.A. Jack Unterweger, the journalist, walked among Hollywood lights by day and hunted beneath them by night. He charmed his way into into Hollywood's Austrian and German circles, met diplomats, and even visited LAPD headquarters. He was given a ride-along with an officer through the city's red light districts, watching the very streets where he would later stalk his prey. And then, when the night fell quiet, the killer in him went to work again. Shannon Exley was 35, a mother, a daughter, a woman trying to survive the streets of downtown Los Angeles. She never saw the darkness that followed her that June night. Jack picked her up, as he had done so many times before with others, smiling, polite, almost charming, the perfect disguise. Hours later, her body was found, strangled with her own bra, discarded like a forgotten dream. A week later, Irene Rodriguez, 33, met the same fate. Then in early July, Peggy Booth, also known as Sherry Ann Long, was discovered dead in the Hollywood Hills. 3 women, 3 murders, all within days, all bound by the same method, the same knot, the same monster. Back in Austria, detectives began to notice the eerie pattern. The crimes in Los Angeles mirrored those in Vienna almost perfectly. The signature was unmistakable. Jack Unterweger was no longer just a suspect. He was the link between 2 continents of death. But while police worked quietly to connect the dots, Jack returned home to Austria, proudly submitting his report about crime in Los Angeles. He described American prostitution, violence, and fear, as if he hadn't been the very cause of it. It was genius and insanity. For months, he evaded suspicion, smiling for cameras, performing readings of his own poetry about the darkness of man. But every poem, every word, every breath reeked of guilt. By the time authorities gathered enough evidence to act, Jack had already vanished, and what followed was a chase across borders, a manhunt for a killer who had once been celebrated as a saint. Interpol joined the hunt, tracing Jack through Switzerland, France, and into the United States. With him was his 18-year-old girlfriend, Bianca Emrach, young, innocent, unaware that she was sleeping beside a murderer. He traveled under fake names, changing hotels, cities, and stories, leaving behind a trail of lies and empty promises. In February 1992, after weeks on the run, the FBI and U.S. Marshals caught up with him in Miami, Florida. Jack Unterweger, the man who fooled a nation, was finally in handcuffs when he was extradited to Austria. The country that once called him a hero now saw him for what he was, a monster in a poet's skin. His trial began in June 1994 in Graz. The courtroom was packed with reporters, fans, and the curious. Everyone desperate to see how a man so gifted could be so cruel. The evidence was overwhelming. Fibers, DNA, eyewitnesses, travel records, and that knot, his unmistakable signature of death. Prosecutors linked him to 9 murders, including the 3 in Los Angeles, 7 in Austria, and 1 in Prague. He sat calmly through it all, dressed neatly, smiling faintly, like a man watching someone else's story unfold. On June 29th, 1994, the jury found him guilty. 9 murders, life imprisonment, no parole, no redemption left to fake. That night, he returned to his cell in Graz-Carlau prison, the same type of cage where his false redemption had begun 15 years before. But Jack had one last chapter to write. When the guards checked on him the next morning, Jack Unterweger was hanging from the ceiling of his cell. He had used his shoelaces and a tracksuit cord, tied in the same knot he used to strangle his victims. No note, no apology, just silence. It was as if he wanted to prove that even in death, he controlled the story. Some called it justice, others called it irony. But for the families of the women he murdered, it was never enough. They were left with questions that would never be answered, and a reminder that evil can wear the face of intellect, charm, and art. After his death, forensic evidence continued to emerge, further confirming his guilt. Investigators revisited old cases in Europe, uncovering more possible victims, each bearing the same mark of his cruelty. The legend of the Vienna Woods killer grew darker over time, and the world realized that they hadn't just freed a murderer, they had celebrated him. Jack Unterweger had written books about redemption, and the world had believed every word. But behind his literary success lay a truth so twisted it still chills those who read his words today. He didn't just write about death, he wrote with it, and in the end, his final story, the one written by his own hand in a prison cell, was the only one that ever told the truth. As the years passed, the name Jack Unterweger became a warning, a ghost story whispered in classrooms, crime shows, and documentaries. He was the man who fooled the system, who turned rehabilitation into a weapon, who proved that monsters can wear the mask of genius. And somewhere in the archives of Austrian television, you can still find footage of him smiling, talking about morality, about art, about second chances. Watch closely. You'll see it, the coldness behind his eyes, the calculation in his smile. The man who could charm his way into your trust and strangle you before dawn. He wasn't just a killer. He was a storyteller, and his stories were written in blood. Every crime scene, every knot, every life he stole was another paragraph in the tale he never stopped writing. And tonight, as his name echoes once again through midnight whispers, we remember that evil doesn't always lurk in the dark. Sometimes it stands beneath the spotlight, holding a pen, pretending to be human. This was the story of Jack Unterweger, the writer, the liar, the killer. Thank you for listening. And remember, the next time someone tells you they've changed, listen carefully to what they're not saying. Because sometimes the monsters never change. They just learn to write better stories.